TV and film have shown us the dark side of human nature for decades. From violence to outright murder, the most gruesome things have been depicted on the screen. But even the goriest flicks pale in comparison to the crimes on our list. These people, seemingly inspired by Hollywood, did the unthinkable. From a wannabe serial killer to a perpetual criminal, here are killers inspired by TV. Dexter Morgan, the fictional serial killer with a twisted sense of justice, holds a strange appeal for many. Fans are captivated by his meticulous methods and moral code, killing only those he deems deserving. For most, it's just a fleeting fascination, but for Mark Twitchell, it became a blueprint for real-life murder. A 29-year-old aspiring filmmaker from Alberta, Canada, Mark's obsession with Dexter spiraled far beyond fan admiration. He didn't just idolize the character, he tried to live like him, taking the leap from fiction to chilling reality. Behind the veneer of his filmmaking ambitions, Mark was plotting a far darker script. While working on a Star Wars fan film and House of Cards, Mark hatched a plan to imitate Dexter's methods. But unlike the fictional killer, he didn't have access to police databases to find victims. Instead, he turned to the internet, posing as a woman to lure unsuspecting men to a garage in Edmonton. One of his targets was Giles Tetrault, who arrived expecting a date. Instead, he walked into Mark's twisted attempt at recreating Dexter's world. Twitchell's plan failed when Giles fought him off and escaped. Years later, the victim would write a book called The One Who Got Away, detailing how the attacker tried to scare him with a fake gun. The unsuspecting Giles arrived at the garage thinking he was going on a date, but the aspiring filmmaker sprung up on him and tried to subdue him. This effort was unsuccessful as the would-be victim fought him off and ran away. Years later, he would publish a book called The One Who Got Away, where he said that Mark tried to scare him with a fake gun before he escaped.
He must have grabbed me, and we started struggling. Oh, and I'm guessing during this, that's when I'm like, okay, I gotta try to fight. And that's something I missed, actually. I tried punching him too, but I was so weak. And I remember trying to punch him, and I know I can't hit this mask because that's gonna hurt my hands, so I'm trying to punch him in his chest. And I'm thinking, man, why am I so weak? And my punches aren't, I feel like I'm not doing anything, and it's like my punches are so weak. And then, so I realized, okay, I'm punching him, I'm not going to do anything. He's way bigger than me, and can't do anything. So then I started trying to kick him in the
One of the more chilling parts of this case is that Mark went out of his way to document his efforts. In a file on his computer, the wannabe director stored his SK Confessions, which meant Serial Killer Confessions. He wrote about his first failed attempt to commit murder and his plans to try again. This story is based on true events. The names and events were altered slightly to protect the guilty. This is the story of my progression into becoming a serial killer. One paragraph of the document said, rather than give up on his serial killer ambitions, the aspiring filmmaker tried again and was able to lure another man named John Altinger to the garage. Johnny spoke to someone he thought was a woman named Jen on a dating site and was excited when he was invited for a romantic getaway. In an email to his friends, he said they were going on a tropical vacation. What he didn't know was that his dream getaway was more of a nightmare, and when he arrived at the garage, he sealed his fate. Unlike Giles, this man wouldn't be so lucky, and was beaten and stabbed to death by Mark. In true Dexter fashion, the killer laid Johnny's body on a table and proceeded to dismember him. His body parts were burned, put in a garbage bag, and then thrown into a storm sewer. While he was carrying out these gruesome acts, the filmmaker allegedly wore a hockey mask, which could be a callback to another iconic on-screen killer, Jason Voorhees. As he was pursuing his dream of becoming the real-life Dexter, Mark's marriage with a woman named Jess Twitchell fell apart, and she would later cite extreme and repeated mental cruelty in their divorce proceedings. And of course, this successful effort was documented on his computer. Soon after the murder, the police launched a search for John Altinger and soon came across Mark's rented garage. The authorities confronted him about the blood in the garage, and he tried to cover it up by saying it was fake blood he was using for a movie. One reason why Dexter is such a popular character is because he was known to talk his way out of being caught, and always covered his tracks. Mark tried to emulate this, but neglected to get rid of the blood residue on the trunk of the car. Once the police found this, it was all they needed. On October 31st, 2008, the father of one was ambushed by the police outside of his parents' house, arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Ironically, the police used his MO against him by having an undercover cop posing as a potential investor in his movie.
We sucked you in on the internet. The guy you were going to meet at the coffee shop, undercover policeman. The guy you were bringing your portfolio to try and get him buy shares in your movie, undercover policeman. Boy, is that ironic.
After searching for his property, detectives found his computer with the SK files on it. So, when the 29-year-old stood trial in 2011, prosecutors had his own documented evidence of his crimes and even a to-do list. Another damning piece of evidence was repeated posts on Facebook and private writings about the character of Dexter, which showed that Mark was undoubtedly fascinated by the serial killer.
Nobody would side with Dexter Morgan if he went around slaughtering school teachers and mail carriers on a whim.
They also searched his studio-turned-murder room that had the windows blacked out with black garbage bags, which didn't do his case any favors. However, true to his Dexter persona, Mark tried to defend himself by bringing up his planned horror movie. The way he explained it, the plot of the film was about a man luring other men into a garage and killing them. He said the attacks on Giles and Johnny were part of a plan to drum up publicity for the film. The plan was for them to escape, and then the story would bring more attention to his movie. His victim, he said, was simply an accident. However, the two men didn't know about the Canadian's movie and didn't consent to any publicity stunts. The jury wasn't convinced of any of these claims and found him guilty of first-degree murder, sentencing him to 25 years to life in prison with a possibility of parole. His legal team initially tried to file an appeal, but this was later dropped, and Mark is serving his sentence to this day. But even though he ended a man's life and destroyed his own, the father of one is still enamored with Dexter to this day. Reportedly, he bought a TV set for his cell to continue watching the show that allegedly inspired his murderous tendencies. The convicted murderer has also been allowed to sign up for a dating website despite luring his victim from 1 year ago. While the former filmmaker has been eligible for parole since 2023, he remains imprisoned at Saskatchewan Federal Penitentiary in Saskatchewan, Canada. He's continued to be a source of media fascination, like Steve Lillibouin's book, The Devil's Cinema. Even Michael C. Hall, who portrayed the character of Dexter Morgan, has been asked about the killings. He said that Mark would likely commit acts of violence with or without the show. I wouldn't stop making Dexter because someone was fascinated by it, only in that way. I try to tell myself that their fixated nature would have done it one way or another, but it seems that Dexter had only something to do with it. It's horrifying, he said. The same could be said of our next entry, which took inspiration from one of the most brutal murderers ever to grace the screen. If the Saw movies are known for anything, it is their explicit violence and gore. The killer at the center of the franchise is Jigsaw, who traps victims in near impossible death traps to force them to appreciate their lives and change their ways. The graphic depictions of people being hurt and killed might have brought in millions to the box office, but they seemingly also inspired Matthew Tinling to try them out for himself. This killer had a long history of drug abuse and was living in a shelter home with another man named Richard Hamilton in Maida Vale, London. In April 2012, the 25-year-old decided that he wanted to buy some crack cocaine and needed some money. The closest source of funds would be his roommate Richard, who refused to hand over his PIN and bank details. Richard was known to be in a better financial situation than the other building residents. On top of £272 in benefits every fortnight, he received a £197 disability allowance. Matthew figured that he could use up this money to feed his addiction and would stop at nothing to get it. In the weeks before the incident, he had bullied and intimidated his roommate to the point that he'd even become reclusive. Now, things were about to come to a head. The conflict soon turned violent, and he took to attacking his roommate, stabbing him 17 times on the head in a bid to coax the information out of him. After the stabbing, Matthew took some inspiration from the sixth film in the Saw franchise and attempted to sever the 45-year-old's spinal cord. After Richard had died, the murderer-turned-thief took several suspicious trips out of the house. One of these was to a cash machine to withdraw 240 pounds, and other trips to dump trash bags in the bins. Ironically, it was the DNA evidence found on the cash machine, as well as on the curtains of the flat, that led to the 25-year-old being pegged as the culprit. CCTV footage showed him leaving his flat 15 minutes before the cash was withdrawn, and while 3 of the men were initially arrested in connection with the death, they were released. When the police conducted a search of the flat, they found a DVD in the drug user's room of Saw 6, the film where a character has their spinal cord severed. The verdict came back as a minimum of 30 years for the killing. And just like what has been said about the murders in the Saw movies, the former soldier's death was described as savage and obviously prolonged. Judge Timothy Pontius went on to say, "You inflicted 17 wounds during the attack, the most serious of which was delivered specifically with the intention of severing the spinal cord, thus to cause paralysis and death, exactly as you had seen on the DVD." Even though Matthew is now behind bars, it seems his Saw-inspired reign of terror has not ended. In 2016, while imprisoned at HMP Woodhill, he attacked a fellow inmate. A convicted killer and a fellow inmate named Jason Gomez teamed up to attack a man named Charles Story. Wielding homemade knives, they stabbed him repeatedly, and even lodged a piece of sharpened plastic in his eye. He bagged another life sentence for his crime, but only went on to commit more acts of violence. In 2021, he attacked a guard at the same facility and injured them so badly that they needed 18 stitches in the aftermath. The attack happened during the daily workout when Matthew asked to be returned to his cell early. But as soon as the gates were opened, he charged at the warden and later bragged about causing damage to his face. Outside of physical violence, some staff at the drug user's facility have been concerned about things he'd said in recent times. The killer had previously told his psychologist that they'd betrayed his first, and told his unit office that his head was going. It's also been reported that he's shown little remorse for his actions, instead taunting his high court judge by saying that he'd been a naughty boy. In the wake of this repeated violence, the repeat offender has seen his earliest date of parole moved from 2055 to 2062. While there is still debate about the role that the Saw films played in his actions, it's clear that the now 37-year-old is prone to violent outbursts. Anyone, whether an inmate or a warden, can be on the receiving end. While the Jigsaw is considered an anti-hero by some, Matthew seems to harm others solely for his own personal gain. What are your thoughts? Do you believe they would have killed even without the influence of TV and movies? Let me know in the comments.